My name is Nick Marchek, and I am a BIM specialist here at Microsol Resources in Philadelphia. Ultimately, today my goal is to demystify some of the tools that come with the AEC collection, if only to give you help you get your foot in the door so you can begin to get some useful mileage out of these tools right away. Everything we talk about today all come as part of your AEC collection, as Jeremy had mentioned, but what we're going to cover is not too detailed or complicated at all to use. Most everyone will be able to use some of these tools right off the bat. Now, that's not to say that these aren't complex programs, and you can go down the rabbit hole on any one of them, but our goal is to learn some workflows that will hopefully make your lives a little easier. And we certainly can't cover all of the tools in the AEC collection, but I pulled out a couple that I think are quite useful that many people may not be familiar with. So our first topic is Format and how it can be used in conjunction with Revit. Okay, so what is Format? Simply put, it's an early stage modeling tool very similar to SketchUp. In terms of some of the key benefits, first, and in all honesty, we know that some designers, or most, which is quite possible, don't love working in Revit in the conceptual or schematic design phase, mainly because they feel it can be a little unwieldy that early in the design process. There are actually a number of tools that people use, probably the most popular being SketchUp. Some even use AutoCAD and other applications in those early design stages. However, anyone who's ever used SketchUp knows that in the past, those models have never really translated very well into Revit once ready for documentation. That's mainly due to geometries and meshes that don't jive well with Revit. That being said, Autodesk has been making some strides with importing SketchUp files into Revit, especially with the most recent 2020 release of Revit, though there are still some limitations. So, enter Format, which has recently evolved quite considerably and now can be rather useful in the design process. And most importantly, it has native Revit interoperability, which allows for a more seamless workflow. Now, that's not to say the Format is only useful in the early stages of the design process, but by using Format plus Revit plus Insight, which we'll actually get to a little bit later in the presentation, we now have a more comprehensive solution from conceptual design through CDs. This image here shows different phases of the work that can be done in Format, basically from simple massing to complex rendered images. On the left is a massing study with a solar analysis that can be performed at any phase of the design through an Autodesk Insight. On the right is a more stylistic hidden line rendering view with shadows, extended edges, lower contrast lines. And then in the middle is kind of the traditional rendering that this can be used in any phase. By uploading your Format model to the cloud, you can access and present your models anywhere on multiple devices through Format 360. Format can also act as a pre-flight tool where you can bring in geometries from other applications such as SketchUp or Entourage by using plugins in Format to validate and clean the elements from other resources that may have invalid geometries. All this then allows us to bring this information into Revit through the use of import tools built into the Revit platform that we'll look at here in a little bit. So, Format was updated earlier this year, which included a number of updates, but I want to key on a couple of them in this presentation. First, just to give you a quick glance, you have your standard modeling and drawing tools, and you can manipulate the user interface any way that you want to. And you also have viewing tools, just like any other 3D software. It just takes a little time to get used to the interface within Format. To the point of Format acting as a pre-flight tool for bringing in geometries from other applications, such as SketchUp, as I mentioned, the plugin manager that you see over here on the right allows you to do a couple of different things. So let me bring up Format here real quick. So I have a model open here. So here I have my plugin manager open. One of the tools is the Validate and Clean model. This can be used for SketchUp or Entourage to fix any information or fix any issues and get them a little bit more BIM ready for use in Revit or Format as the case may be. So all you would really do is you just click on this button here. It opens up another dialog box. You can say validate the model. And here we see there's a couple, there's an issue with the bitmap, so we can go through and review that. We can also run a clean model, and we can set the tolerance here. Run OK, give it a second here, and it should come. I've cleaned it earlier, so it should come back with no errors for us. Yep. So that's one of the tools that you can find in here in the plugin manager. So again, you can bring in SketchUp information into the format model, and then start to use some of these tools to help kind of close up and rectify some of those issues that you see with the model. There's also some other out-of-the-box tools, as you can see here. There's all sort of a number of tools that you can explore. One of the other ones that I wanted to point out was you can basically extract material maps. You can mesh, unmesh all. There's a number of different things that you can do with Format, either in the early stages or in preparation to bring it into Revit. One thing I wanted to point out in this presentation was with the recent updates, Dynamo files are actually now integrated locally inside of Format. What this means is you can simply use the graphs that are baked in a kind of out of the box, or you can actually load and then drag and drop and edit directly in a Format. The way to access Dynamo from within Format is over here on this tab here. So we click on this. So what you can do basically is you see here we have a couple different options baked in. One of which is the stairs that I'll show you. So you would just click on here, say bake into Format. And then you can just drop this stair in here. And if I escape twice to get out of it, what I can do is I can double click on it. And here you can see the dialog box that comes up. Basically, this is a graphical representation of the inputs in the actual Dyno script being used. So if I were to change my stair width here and click Run Graph, it should, I may have made it a little too big. Oh, yeah, so it updates the stair here. So it's kind of a baked-in piece of geometry that's using the Revit, the Dynamo script. If you actually wanted to edit the Dynamo script, if you were comfortable with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about Dynamo here in a second, you can click on the Edit in Dynamo and actually open up the actual Dynamo editor and edit the script from there. So, oops. As I mentioned earlier, importing from SketchUp typically involves a handful of steps. However, with the converter that's now built into Revit and the recent updates, it's a faster process. Typically, the two most common ways to import SketchUp into Revit were either by exporting an IFC file from SketchUp and then importing that into Revit, or to create an in-place family in Revit and use the import CAD command. However, as I mentioned, and as some of you may be familiar with, there are certainly limitations to how Revit actually treats this data. So now what we can do is we can use an add-in through Revit to make the conversion process easier and faster. It's actually under the Add-ins tab in Revit. And from this drop-down, you can see here I kind of blew up what our different options are. The Import Format to Revit command adds the format model into an existing Revit project. So that's, again, on the kind of the idea of connected BIM, using all of these programs seamlessly that we're talking about here. That's how we would be able to bring in so for example, this, if I were to wanted to bring in this model that we have here from Format, I can easily do that by bringing in importing the format file into Revit, because it has that native interoperability, as I mentioned before. The format origin point and the Revit base point are used for placement of the format geometry. So just so you know that they will read each other again as it goes along, as it goes to the point of having that native language between the two. It'll read that information for you. Revit system families can also be exported to Format if you wanted to use those families you've created in Revit for format models as well. And then finally, as I had mentioned, you can use the add-in directly in Revit to select a SketchUp file to be converted to a format file. Autodesk is making improvements with the abilities of Revit to import SketchUp, especially with this release of Revit 2020, as I mentioned. But by using Format, you can actually open or import SketchUp files like we just looked at, and then you can use the tools from the plugin in Format, so it's even more user-friendly once you bring that information into Revit. All right, so we just discussed a little how Format can be used in Revit and touched on Dynamo. Now what we're going to do is dig into Dynamo a little bit more to help automate the design process. As we all know, there's so much information to consider when looking at the design and the construction of a building, some of which can be mind-numbing, repetitive tasks. Add to that, being comfortable with the actual technology associated with performing all of those tasks, it can get a bit cumbersome. Fortunately, there are a number of ways to automate Revit, two of the most popular being Dynamo and Revit macros. Both are programming based, but the difference is that macros are text-based programs, which typically involve understanding the programming language, whereas Dynamo is a more of a visual programming tool, and thus more accessible to those of us with that type of a mindset. Now, I want to at least acknowledge that Dynamo is certainly a powerful design tool, and certainly, those of us that are familiar with Dynamo are probably familiar with some of the, the fancy shapes and whatnot that you can see that people have created out of Dynamo. And there's a large portion of the community that is focused on how visual scripting can be used for computational designing and complex form finding. However, there's also a large contingent using visual scripting to bridge the gaps in everyday workflow using Revit. Dynamo can be used for many, many things, but we will be focusing mostly on automating tasks. There's a lot that we can do that is repetitive in Revit. Doing something in Revit is pretty simple, but doing it over and over and over again, 10, 20, 50 times, that can take up quite a bit of time. However, Dynamo can help us with that. Some examples of this would be, renumbering a sequence of sheets, flipping grid heads, batch insert families, changing text from uppercase to lowercase or vice versa, and importing and exporting data to and from Excel. I'm showing this image here because this is the type of visualization that scares some people off from Dynamo. They look at this and say, I just don't have the time to learn how to do that. So I don't want that last image to deter you. By all means, learn Dynamo if you see the potential benefits. There's certainly plenty of videos and sites to help with that process. But ultimately, my goal is during this presentation is to review some of the tools that you can use right away. Therefore, we aren't really going to talk a lot about the Dynamo editor, which is what I had mentioned back in the previous image when discussing with, and also when discussing with Formit. Instead, we're going to focus more on the Dynamo player that's actually built into Revit. That being said, I still wanted to break down Dynamo a little before showing you how to use the Dynamo scripts in Revit without really knowing how to work in the Dynamo Studio editor. So this image here is kind of Dynamo 101 in a more digestible diagram. So just to give you an idea of how Dynamo works, each node that we have here performs a specific task, and the nodes have inputs and outputs. The outputs from one node connect to the inputs to another node via these wires, and the program or graph basically flows from node to node through the network of wires, resulting in a graphic representation of the steps required to achieve the desired output. But as I mentioned, the good news is that you don't even have to be able to create scripts in the Dynamo editor to take advantage of Dynamo scripts. Although it certainly is admittedly helpful to understand the basics so you can edit graphs in the Dynamo editor if it comes to that point and it's necessary. So there are really three ways to use Dynamo. The first being the Dynamo Studio. This is a standalone software that's included in the AEC package. It's an application that you have access to, like I said, through the AEC collection. It's standalone. There's also Dynamo for Revit add-in. Both of these options are relatively the same, other than Studio is a standalone, whereas the add-in just launches the editor directly from within Revit. The third option that I mainly want to focus on is the Dynamo player. It actually has a couple of built-in graphs that you can use. I've downloaded a few that are not out of the box that I'll show you in a minute, and you can download graphs from other people from across the internet. There's a large, expansive Dynamo network, so you can dig around, do some Google searching, see if you can find, I have this idea that I want Dynamo to do. Let me see if there's some scripts out there that I might be able to use and bring into Revit. So now, how do we actually access the Dynamo player? It can be found, let me bring up Revit here. It can be found on the Manage tab in Revit. Over here on the far right, you simply click on the Dynamo player. So here's where you can access the Dynamo editor with this tool, and here's the Dynamo player. So if I click on this tool, it'll bring up another dialog window with a library of scripts that are loaded onto my particular workstation. You can browse to the location of the scripts using the folder option, or you can open the folder directly. And then if you ever add or make any changes to any of the scripts, you can use this button to kind of refresh your library here at this point. So to run a script from this player, you simply have to click the play button for a lot of the scripts. For example, in this model, you can see that the sheet names over here, basically they use uppercase and lowercase lettering. However, let's say your office standard is all uppercase. So do we go through the change? Do we, this list wouldn't be too time consuming, but let's say you had 100 sheets. Do we want to go through and change every single title? We certainly can, but we can save time by using one of the scripts that's built into here, one of which is the update sheet names to uppercase. So if I click the play button, you'll see over here that quickly it updated all of my titles from uppercase and lowercase lettering to all uppercase. That is, that again, this is only 10 sheets or the like, so it wouldn't take that time normally to do that manually. But if we're talking 75 to 100 sheets, that could be quite time consuming. So this is just one way that Dynamo can start to automate that process for us. If you ever needed to edit a script, you can click on the pencil icon, and it will take us into the Dynamo editor. Here I'll just show you that one time. I've mentioned it a couple times, but I haven't actually opened the Dynamo editor itself. So let me bring this over. So this is what the Dynamo, if we click on that pencil icon, this will bring us into, and you can see here basically the script for that particular Dynamo script that we have loaded in our player. So let me close out of that. Let me bring Revit back up. Sometimes we'll be required to input information or select elements that are in Revit in order to make the script play correctly. For example, what if you wanted to create 50 levels for a high-rise building? There's actually a simple Dynamo script that can help you with that. Let me zoom out here a little bit, and that would be this one right here, the add levels above the selected level. So what you can see here is if I go in and click on the editor, it'll bring up a little dialog window where I can enter some of this information. So like I said, let's say we want to do 50 levels, and now what it's prompting me to do is I can set a distance from the selected level that I'll be picking. So it's prompting me to pick one level, so I'll grab one of these levels down here, and I think I grabbed it, and I'll click play. Oops. Zoom in. There we go. Now I'll click play. And you can see here that it quickly generated 50 new levels above that level that was selected at an increment of 10 feet above each level. So there you go. You have new levels. So as with the full Dynamo editor itself, there are tons of resources on the internet where you can download different scripts that can be saved to you can save to the player folder. So if I go back here, click on this guy, here you can see the folder tree. This is where I can drop additional scripts if I find them on the internet, if I've tested them out and I'm happy with them and I want to load them into Revit. So let me go back here, close that. All right. So we just discussed a little on how Dynamo can be used with Revit. Now we're going to look at how easy it is to use Insight to create quick energy model analyses of our buildings throughout the entire design process. As some of you may not be familiar, I just want to kind of cover what is Insight. It is an online tool from Autodesk that calculates building model energy use and performance. It's accessed through the Analyze tab in Revit. Let me just pull Revit up here again. So through the Analyze tab, you can see over here, this is the Insight tab, and then here are some add-ins that you can add in as well. But what we'll be focusing on mainly the energy optimization tab here. Insight uses cloud-based software to run simulations based on the design. So it uses DOE 2.2, Energy Plus, and ASHRAE 140 are the simulation engine platforms that are used. Those simulation engines are validated and updated frequently to meet these particular standards. So Insight provides a visualization of key performance metrics, and it also provides a range of outcomes, also known as dynamic analysis. which this allows you to see the changes and how they would impact the performance and the energy use. As you can start to see in the image here on the bottom right, which we'll get into a little bit more, there are sliders that allow for you to make changes that will allow you to see how those changes would or could impact the design if implemented into the model. Insight doesn't just run one simulation like traditional energy analysis, if anyone is familiar with it. It actually runs many simulations. And this is certainly the most significant feature of Insight, as it allows the user to input adjustments as opposed to traditional static analysis, which requires all inputs be selected before running the simulation, and then only one scenario at a time. So again, different from most energy modeling, as it works with Revit or Formit model at any phase of the design process, because typical energy modeling is done at the end of the design process, when, as we are all aware of, changes are much more difficult to integrate. Insight allows us to work with our existing Revit models at any phase. It can also be used to help generate reports for the Architecture 2030 challenge, as I'll show you here in a little bit. So, what is energy analysis? Analysis and optimization are interchangeable terms for our discussion, as you may hear both used as I talk today. Energy analysis is a basic comparison of model scenarios, comparing things like building orientation or building envelope construction, glazing percentages, material thermal properties, or just basic mechanical and HVAC systems. Now, the next question might be, why use energy analysis? First of all, I'd say because it's easy. Secondly, it helps understand the impact of your design decisions on building performance and energy use. And finally, it can be used to demonstrate that the design meets specific energy guidelines. Again, this is mainly ASHRAE 90.1, Architecture 2030, but also state energy codes. So this slide here shows the Insight tools in Revit. There are also additional add-ons for heating, cooling, lighting, and solar, as I just showed you. And again, this presentation is mainly focusing on the energy analysis tool built into Revit. So one significant note that I want to mention is that the model does not have to be watertight. Insight actually accounts for this. This is a little different from other energy modeling. So where other energy modeling software requires a much more stringent enclosure, which is partially the reason for the majority of energy analysis taking place toward the end of the design process, when Revit models are a little bit more buttoned up near completion. Insight actually allows for inconsistencies and gaps in the model, as we can actually set the tolerance for this information in the simulations. The only required setting is location. Insight will run a range of outcomes for you, so it's not necessary to be well-versed in advanced settings. You certainly can work with more advanced settings, and again, I would recommend getting familiar with them, similar to what I mentioned with Dynamo, if you would like to take Insight to the next level. I just want to emphasize that you don't need to be well-versed in order to effectively run and utilize Insight. So let's walk through a couple of these tools in Revit here. So let me go to my Revit model. So here, if I go under my Analyze tab, again, this is where our tools are. So first of all, this is the location. If I click this, it'll bring up a dialog where I can set the location. The next tab this says delete energy model. That's because I have an energy model created for the sake of time in this presentation, but normally this will say create energy model. And what this does is it creates a new 3D view in Revit that I'll show you in a second. And more importantly, it simplifies the model in this view, in the view that's created to something more appropriate for energy analysis. This says delete energy model because I can actually delete and redo the energy model. So just to show you, so you can see here, we're in our typical 3D view that everybody's accustomed to in Revit. When I click on generate, it creates a new 3D view for me, basically called an analytical spaces model under 3D views. So this is what you'll get, and this information is what you would then send to the cloud. So the generate tool right here, this sends the information to the cloud for simulation analysis. You'll get an email saying that it's been received, and then you'll get a second email once the analysis takes place, and that analysis can take anywhere from 10 minutes to over an hour, depending on the complexity of the model and the analysis that you're running. The other tool here is Optimize, and this takes you directly into Insight 360 to review the model, and then you would basically just have to wait for the analysis to run. And finally, the energy settings. Again, I mentioned these are the basic setup for the settings. We won't get into that, but you can refine the settings if you want to dig into that information. There's some default settings that are set up, and the settings are more of an advanced topic that we're not going to get into here. All right, so at this point, for the sake of discussion, we've created our energy model in Revit. We've adjusted the settings if necessary, and we've sent the model to the cloud for simulation. So let's walk through the user interface for Insight 360 in the Internet browser. One second. There we go. Okay. So this is the user interface in Insight 360. Again, it's a web-based platform that you can access through your Autodesk account. When you get your second email after you've generated the energy analysis, you can click on a link and it'll bring you right to your model in the Insight 360. Just to reiterate, the beauty of Insight is allows the user to compare the effects of different design scenarios without actually affecting the Revit model itself. So any changes that we make that we'll walk through here in a minute don't actually change the Revit model. They're just changing scenarios that can then be translated into the Revit model once decisions have been made. As you can see, we get a standard Autodesk 360 viewer for the model. The analytical model can be navigated, zoomed, sectioned, rotated, just the same as any other Revit 3D model and any viewer that we have available to us. In the upper left-hand corner here, we have the resulting energy cost mean. We'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. Directly below that is the geographical location, and this was set in Revit. And again, in order to run an analysis for Insight, the only required setting is location. So as long as we have that set, we can run energy analysis at any stage of the design process. The first block that we have here in the second row gives us the benchmark comparison, and this shows us Architcture 23 and ASHRAE 90.1 benchmarks in relation to the highest and lowest possible cost range, otherwise known as the best and worst case scenarios based on energy usage. Both the energy cost mean and the benchmark comparison update simultaneously to any changes that we make in this dashboard down below. The goal is ultimately to get to green. This middle block here shows us the model history. So it tracks all the changes that we have made to the energy analysis, but again, it does not apply to the Revit model. So any changes that we make in the sliders here to make adjustments to this benchmark comparison, we can see here in the model history, but it won't make any changes to the Revit model. The rest of the blocks that we see down here are all interactive factors and ranges for the energy analysis that we just ran. Pretty much a full landscape of all the things that can really drive energy modeling for us. So you can see here we have different glazing panels. We had orientation up here. You can see if I do infiltration, roof construction, wall construction, daylighting, occupancy controls. There's a whole slew of options that we can filter through and review changes. So by clicking anywhere in any one of these particular panels, it'll bring up a new dialog window with a chart on it that shows an active slider as well as our energy cost range value here. So the blue triangle that we see down here, this is called the BIM setting, and this basically shows what is actually modeled that was sent from Revit up to the cloud. Instead of simulating just one value, though, it shows us several different values. And by using this slider, you can see what making changes would do. So this is going to be pretty minuscule just because the slider is not too severe. But you can see here, as I slide from one option to another, it brings up a little window where it starts to say, discuss some of the changes that we're making. You can see what making changes would do to our energy cost mean, basically an immediate cause and effect. And you'll see this as an increase or decrease in the energy cost range and benchmark comparison. The critical thing to understand is that, not only are we testing what is modeled, but a range of scenarios that can drive the cost of energy. If I click out of this, you can see here, let me see here, here's something a little bit more steeper incline. So the steeper the incline of the values, the more opportunity for potential savings. So you can see here, if I slide this up here, you can see how that drastically changes my energy cost mean there. So you can see just moving this slider back and forth will give us different results. You can also, if I go back up to the top, you can also save different scenarios to compare and contrast the settings and scenarios. Either in the upper right-hand corner or over here in the flyout, you can actually create different scenarios where you can save them to model and you can make adjustments. So not only can you see adjustments in the model history, but you can make save scenarios that you can review and then make design decisions and translate that back to your Revit model. So back on the topic of the energy cost mean a little bit. It can either be cost or EUI. It's often easier for users to see the energy cost mean represented in dollars per square foot as opposed to the EUI. I'd recommend using cost, even though the 2030 references EUI as you get started. If you're unfamiliar with EUI, it's a building's annual energy use per unit area, and it's typically measured in thousands of BTU per square foot per year. It's important as EUI is useful for comparing performance of buildings across sizes, types, and locations, and used in a number of different reporting. Just to give you an idea of the color range that you'll see in Insight 360 as you work with it. The red basically means that it's poor. Orange means that you're hitting ASHRAE 90.1. Green means that you're meeting the Architecture 2030. And green with a negative number means that you're at net zero. Insight can also be used to quickly compare design scenarios. We kind of already touched that a little bit on, within the main Insight 360 user interface. In an individual model, you can look at the model history. You can also, if I bring it back up here one more time, and I go back, click on Insight, you can also compare models against each other in the main Insights splash page to track scenarios and performance over the life cycle of the design process by using the model comparison panel over here. Now this is going to look a little wonky only because you can see here I have two detailed models in here as well as a bunch of kind of massing studies that I had in there. But you can see here I will start to compare the results of whatever models I may have in my Insights in my Insights account. So as I mentioned, you can have iterations of your model from conceptual through CDs that could be all loaded in here, and you can start to compare the information from this model comparison tab here. If you're not familiar with Architecture 2030 Challenge, it's essentially a series of step goals to get to carbon neutrality by 2030 by reducing fossil fuel consumption. The goal is 80% by 2020 and 90% by 2025. You only need two settings in Revit for the 2030 comparison. So I had mentioned that you only need a location set for running Insight in a general sense. In order to accomplish the reporting for the 2030 challenge, you need location plus building type, which is in the advanced settings. So how can Insight actually help with the 2030 challenge? There's a direct link from the model to the 2030 DDX, which is otherwise known as the Design Data Exchange. This creates a report that can be sent directly to the company's site on the DDX, where you can compare to other benchmark projects from across the country. This allows you to pull the report at more frequent intervals throughout the design process as well. So we've covered how to use Formit, Dynamo, and Insight in conjunction with Revit. Now let's take a quick look at Navisworks Manage. So for those of you unfamiliar, what is Navisworks Manage? It's a software that allows AEC professionals to combine and coordinate models and data from multiple resources in one holistic file for review. It is not a 3D modeling program, but a program that converts large Revit models into smaller models that are more manageable with multiple team members. So what are some of the key benefits? For designers, the number one benefit of Navisworks Manage is the ability to combine multiple file types and or models to run clash detection. Similarly, if contractors or even the designers can run clash detection, we can also decrease RFIs, presumably, by allowing us to look at all of the information together in a holistic model. You can open models or merge models from BIM 360. So if anybody's using BIM 360 application in the cloud, You can use the coordinate application, which was previously known as Glue in BIM 360, and you can then save back to BIM 360, thus allowing access to everyone on the team if they have access to that BIM 360 platform and have the proper permissions in place. Users can also quickly detect mismatches in the models and help to quickly resolve them. This obviously helps streamline the workflow to stay within the projected budget, avoid overspend, and then obviously saves time. Instead of working with separate data for design and construction, you can save time again by combining this information in a single model through the model aggregation and publishing tools. Now, while certainly not limited to the list, the main functions of Navis ManageWorks is to perform design reviews, clash detection between models, and the production of reports based on these clashes. And as mentioned, this is the greatest strength and most commonly used feature of Navisworks. Let me just pull that up here. So here you can see my Navisworks interface here at this point. We can also run, so here's our clash detection tool. You can also run construction simulation through the Timeliner tool. You can run takeoffs of quantities from the model or models and exporting to Excel or other costing software through the quantification tool here. And you can also do renderings, animations, and walkthroughs with our rendering and animator tools here. With regard to connected BIM between programs, as we've been discussing, one of the more powerful tools in Navisworks Manage the designers can use is in conjunction with Revit is the switchback tool. So you can see here, actually, let me take a step back. So what I'm showing here is the clash detection. So if I go back to my tab here, I'll just show you. So in my clash detection tool, I've loaded two models. I've loaded an advanced sample model, and then I've also loaded in the structural advanced sample model that goes along with it. What I need to do is I just select those two and run the test, and it'll start to run a clash of all of the information between those two models. So you can see here how it started to be highlighted where I run into any clashes. It's being highlighted in the red and the green here. I have a couple different options. I can use my review tab up here, and I can start to mark this information up and save it in the file. So if multiple people are using the Navisworks file, they can go through and review any of the clashes. By selecting any one of these, it toggles around to all of the different clashes that I have. So it gives you a lot of opportunity to use the software to run clash detection. You can also under the review tab, under the report tab, you can actually run a report, and I'll show you that in a minute here. So let me go back to my results. So what I wanted to mention was there's actually one of the more powerful tools in Navisworks Manage is the switchback tool. So when you have a Revit model open in Navisworks, you can use the switchback tool to take you back to Revit, focusing on that element, assuming you have Revit open. And also, we must have the Navisworks exporters installed in Revit. So let me show you real quick where. So under add-ins, under external tools, you want to make sure that this is applied and that the Navisworks Switchback 2020 has been selected. So there's a couple different ways to run the switchback tool, but the most effective way is actually after you run clash detection, you can use this tool right over here. So we have this clash 1 selected. I can use my little tool right here, switchback, and you'll start to see, I don't know if you can see, but on my screen, my Revit icon is glowing a little bit. So if I click on Revit, it'll actually take me to, in that model, and it'll highlight that element that we've selected from Navisworks, and you can see here it's been selected, so it's my properties are there for it as well. So that's a very effective way of using the switchback tool and Navisworks in general. One other thing to mention, we can also run reports out of Navisworks. So here's just a couple images of what kind of like a text-based file and the images that we get out of it. So if I go back into Navisworks under my report tab, here here you can select, do you want it XML, HTML, text? I would typically recommend text. And then you can click on Write Report. I'm not going to do that, that's why I had the images. But basically you get a folder of the images of every single clash that's found. that you can send off to team members or consultants. And you also get a text or an HTML file where you can start to decipher some of the information. You will have to know what you're looking for to an extent, but you can start with using the element IDs, just to show you that I've marked here in this text file, to kind of correlate what elements are involved in a specific clash. And you can turn that into, to look at the elements up in Revit and then go from there. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to cover was how you can use the Autodesk Viewer for mobile applications and presentations. So we get a good number of questions regarding, how can someone who doesn't have a license of Revit view the model and or present the information to the client? What I want to show you is the Autodesk Viewer. It's a web-based viewer that's free to anyone who has an Autodesk ID. So as long as you have created an Autodesk account with Autodesk, typically people use their work email address, you would be able to access your Autodesk Viewer in the web browser. So let me pull this up. For the sake of time, I've already loaded a model in, but you would simply click on Upload New File, and then you can just drag and drop that information in. And then after it uploads, you will have access to it, as you can see here. So I just click on my model, it reloads it, and what you can see here is, again, it's viewer.autodesk.com, and now I can navigate my model here in a web-based platform. So it allows you to use it on kind of any mobile device. You can use it, on iPhones, on tablets, on laptops, anything that you need to be able to kind of. Or even, even in office, if you don't, say you're in a conference room, and you don't actually have a piece of, a license to Revit in your conference room, you can upload this to a web browser, open up the browser, and you can use it in your conference room to navigate either with a team or to present to clients or the like. You have multiple tools at your disposal for marking up and presenting. You have section boxes, measure, you can zoom, pan, rotate, there's this interesting little tool here. I've never really quite figured out what, it looks cool, but I don't know what you can actually, what you would really do with it in a presentation. You can see it's starting to get a little choppy on me, it's starting to get upset, but it starts to pull the model apart. So a more simplified model, you might be able to create some type of diagrammatic representation in a drawing set or something of that nature. You have markup tools here. So I have the ability. So if I click on the tool now, I can draw on this. Whatever you may need to do. Let me just cancel out of that. You can save markups and you can actually send them. You can take screenshots. So if I made a markup and I took a screenshot, I could actually send to team members. I could email them to other people, other consultants and the like. You have a home tab, which basically any changes that you make in here will take you back to the original view of the model. And then finally, you get all of the views over here in this diagram, in this dialog box over here, of not only the 3D model itself, but any 3D views that you have created in the model, but actually the sheets as well. So if you wanted to open up, your first floor plan here, you can start to see and move around the actual drawing sheet. It acts almost as a PDF for you. And again, you have your markup tools that you can make markups to this while you're sitting in a meeting with the owner, with the client, or even in a team setting. So that you can save these, send to them, or just save in your Autodesk Viewer and allow the consultants or the team members, once they receive that information or that information is saved, to follow up and make whatever changes were decided upon at that meeting.